Hello and welcome to BQ Prime. Amidst a lot of developments and immense growth that the Indian economy has seen in recent years, one continuing challenge has been high unemployment. That remains the case. Unemployment also remains one of the spaces we have limited data and information on. Azim Premji University has recently released a report on state of working India, and today we're in conversation with Amit Basole, professor of economics at Azim Premji University, to share some of the findings of this report. Amit, thank you so much for taking time out for us today.
Thank you for having me.
So, before we can delve into some specific questions, I do want to begin by asking you for a broad view of employment trends that we're seeing in the Indian economy post the pandemic, where we saw immense structural changes in the employment space.
Right. So let me start by pointing out what our data sources are here. So the government puts out the periodic labor force survey every year that some of your viewers will know about. And the most recent information we have from the survey comes up to the end of 2022. So the last few months are not part of this data set. However, what we see is that, as you referred to, during the pandemic, we saw a big shift in the employment structure of the economy. We saw a growth in self-employment and a growth in agricultural employment because people lost jobs in other sectors. That started reversing itself after the pandemic got over. And in the report, we show that for men, more or less the structure of employment reverted back to what it was before the pandemic, meaning the proportion of people who were self-employed or in agriculture fell after the recovery. But for women, it has not gone back to the pre-pandemic structure. So self-employment and agricultural work still remain more important for women post-pandemic. And related to that, the pace of regular wage job creation slowed down as a result of the pandemic and the economic degrowth that happened.
So, like you've mentioned, the share of non-agricultural employment has risen, but it has not been matched by an increase in the share in regular wage employment. So, what are the reasons for that?
So this, what we refer to, is a more long-run story. So in the report, we have tried to do some analysis of the short run of the pandemic and the recovery process. But most of the report is what you alluded to, which is a long-run story of what has happened to employment as a result of growth in India over the last few decades. And what we find is, particularly starting in the early 2000s, when India entered the high-growth phase, the proportion of workers engaged in agriculture started declining more rapidly. So non-agricultural, non-farm jobs rose, but those are not the jobs necessarily that we think of as the good jobs or the decent jobs, meaning jobs that come with a regular income and other kinds of benefits and so on. Mostly these jobs are of an informal variety. That is what we are trying to say. So workers leave agriculture, but they end up finding jobs either in the construction sector as daily wage workers or in other kinds of services that are petty retail, other kinds of small jobs in hotels, restaurants. There are many sectors that have expanded in India, but which don't come with necessarily with regular salaried work. So that is the kind of separation that we are trying to point to.
All right. So, just because of several structural events that the Indian economy has seen in recent years, there is some sort of a belief that the informal sector, though it still exists, is now gradually shrinking. So, how does that sort of fit in with the findings of your report?
Our report confirms that. We also see, setting aside COVID again, which was a very special case when the informal sector again rose. But before that, we see a steady decrease in the proportion of casual workers as well as self-employed workers in the Indian economy, and a steady rise in the proportion of regular wage workers. So if you look at that as a indicator of the decline in informality, that's one sign. However, it has to be kept in mind that when you say regular wage, a lot of regular wage jobs are also of a very informal kind, meaning they don't come with written contracts, they don't come with provident fund or any other benefits and so on. They just come with a regular salary or wage. That's all. So most of the regular wage jobs that were created in the Indian economy between 2004 and 2019, before the pandemic, they were mostly of this precarious informal kind. So depending on the definition you adopt, you can either say that the informal sector is shrinking because self-employment and casual labor are shrinking, or you can also say that we have still a long way to go because even the regular salary jobs being created are not particularly of the formal kind.
All right. And post the pandemic specifically, how do these trends stand?
So the main difference between the pre-pandemic and the pandemic post-pandemic period is that the decline in self-employment stopped, and again self-employment rose because people lost other kinds of jobs, and at the same time regular wage job creation slowed down because of the pandemic and the impact of that. Now after that, so let's say the most recent 2-3 quarters or so, we don't have that much clear idea because the data doesn't take us that far. But the thing that we should be watching out for in the data that is coming out in the next few months is, are we again seeing a pickup in the pace of regular wage job creation, and a decline in self-employment? That would be a sign that the economy is starting to recover.
Okay, but so far, and correct me if I'm wrong, self-employment still remains higher than it was pre-pandemic. And that does indicate that labor markets are yet to show a recovery compared to pre-pandemic levels.
Broadly, I would say yes, with the one caveat that for men, actually the levels have gone back to pre-pandemic. It's for women that they have not. As a result of which, one point that what we just mentioned, I will support that with this evidence, that if you look at what has happened to earnings from self-employment and we index them to the pre-pandemic period, then in real terms, from self-employment, people are earning less today than they were prior to the pandemic, which indicates the ongoing impact.
Okay, another recurring theme, and even intuitively what's being said, is that the pace of GDP growth we have seen in India has clearly outstripped the pace of job creation. So, I mean, even from a broader angle, why do you think that's the case? And if that is the case, there is clearly a need for more concerted, specific efforts towards job creation. Do you think there is a clear lag in policy in that space, and there is need for more targeted policy making in that space?
Right. So the answer to the last question, I would say, is definitely yes. There is a need for a lot more targeted attention to employment. The lack of relationship or the weak relationship between GDP growth and employment growth, India is not alone in this. Many countries are struggling with the same problems to do with automation and various other things. However, we have evidence in the report that shows that even setting aside the fact that, even accounting for the fact that this is a struggle for many countries, India is performing a little bit, underperforming a little bit compared to average also, in the sense that our elasticity, the relationship between GDP growth and employment growth, is even smaller than the average across developing countries. So we do have a particular problem on our hands, and we do need a very targeted approach towards employment. Simply promoting faster GDP growth is not going to solve the employment problem.
Okay. So would you have any recommendations in terms of policies? We have seen several states come up with their own policies. At a central level, of course, I think it would be safe to say that post NREGA, we've not seen that much in terms of targeted policy making for employment generation.
So, of course, an NREGA is not really an employment generation, it's a safety net kind of a thing. I would say the recent examples of policies that are particularly focused on employment per se are things like, pre-pandemic, there was this, for example, the Rozgar Protsahan Yojana was one thing that was tried, which was where the government was giving a subsidy to employers in terms of PF contributions for new workers that were hired. Many states had tried it, and it was also implemented at the central level. We don't really know if that has worked very much. I haven't seen too many studies on that. The other way in which we tried to solve specifically the employment issue was by rationalizing the labor laws and making it easier for employers to hire and fire workers, thinking that that would encourage more hiring, and simplifying the contract laws and so on. So all of this, I think, much more study is needed to know if this has worked. Just pardon me a minute. So I don't know if this has worked necessarily because we don't have the necessary studies. the government has, I think, is fully aware that there has to be a concerted effort on employment, and things are being tried on the skilling front and so on. You can even think of the PLI scheme as one way to say, to address this problem, although a lot of the subsidies go to sectors where the job creation is not a very strong part of it. They go to capital intensive sectors mainly. So to answer your question of what should be done, in this year's report, we have not really focused on policies per se, but in the last report that we did in 2021, we had a framework of what we proposed was as a sort of a national employment policy, if you want to think of that. What would be the labor supply side reforms that you want to take into account? What would be the labor demand angles that you have to worry about? For example, how do you promote MSME growth, particularly at the lower of MSMEs, firms that have 10, 20, 30 workers? How do you enable them to grow and hire more workers? How do you enable women to actually participate to the extent that we know they want to participate, but they face constraints such as lack of childcare or public safety? So both from the supply side of labor and the demand side of labor, a set of coherent policies, what can they do to realize the demographic dividend? So we have done some of that work. I refer the readers to that older report.
All right. Thank you so much for taking time out for this, Amit. Just considering the gap in data we have in employment, looking forward to further studies from you guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir.